Hi, welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing a book review for books that I read in January and February. So if you enjoy this type of content, other homeschool and lifestyle content, please remember to subscribe and let's get into it. All right, so I believe I have 7 books to talk about today that I read over January and February. I also have one book that I did not finish that I'm going to share with you and why I had a hard time finishing it. And then I also have another book that's part of a series I read a long time ago that I'll probably be reading occasionally throughout the year. So I just thought I'd mention that as well. So that's kind of how it's gonna go. I'm gonna dig into the recesses of my brain. I'm not as good at remembering all the details of books, even just a few weeks after. My husband can remember stuff for years, like all the nitty gritty details. I cannot. Like within a day, it's already gone. And so I have some things to remind me, and a lot of these are novels, so I won't be telling you the whole story anyways because I don't want to ruin it for you. But I'm gonna pull from the deep recesses of my brain and try to remember some important facts and details to share with you. The first book that I read, I actually don't have here to show you because I read it on my Kindle, and it was Winter Garden by Kristen Hanna. I always mix her name up. I say it backwards all the time. My husband's like, wait, that's not the right way, right? But I love Kristen Hanna's books. I have read several of them. I do have several up on my shelves in my room, but this one was available on Kindle Unlimited, so I didn't buy it. And it was suggested by you guys. And at the same time, so like I had already put it onto my Kindle, but hadn't gotten around to reading it. It had been on there for several months. And then my best friend in Texas was like, oh, have you read this book? I just finished it. We're all talking about it. It's so good. And it's an older book by Kristen Hanna. It's not a newer one. But I was like, oh, it's on my Kindle already. I guess I better get around to reading it. So I did read it. And again, I'm not gonna go into a whole lot of details of the story, but Kristen Hanna writes historical fiction. At least the only books I've read by her are historical fiction. I have not read all of her books. I did see that a lot of her older ones are available on Kindle Unlimited, so I might go through a few more of them. But she has different ways she writes for each of the books that I have read from her. And this one was very different. The way that she chose to go about talking about the history part of it was very different than her other books, which I actually appreciated. I know that some people might not. You know, it might be like, this is too different, or I don't like this style. But I actually really enjoyed the way she went about incorporating the history into the story. So it's placed more in modern day and then goes back and talks about the story. And I really enjoyed it a lot. Her books are always hard for me to say that because she writes in a more real way, as far as it's not always happy. There's sad things that are happening. She shares those like real raw details of how those things and those events would have actually been playing out. Sorry, I had a coughing attack. Still almost over the last little bit of my cold, but it's still just lingering there just a little bit. But she goes into all those very raw, real details. And most of the stories end on some sort of like happy note, I feel like, but you don't get there without a lot of like sadness because it is real. It's not just this is a happy historic fiction book where everything is just perfect. It's not like that. Okay, so if you want that kind of book, maybe you shouldn't read her books, but I really enjoyed this one. So whoever recommended it, thank you so much. And if you have other ones that you'd like to recommend, I would love to read those as well. Like I said, I haven't read a lot of her like older books. Her newer ones, like The Women, is it called The Women or just Women? I don't know, about Vietnam. I've read The Nightingale. I'm trying to even think, oh, I've read The Great Alone. And I feel like there's some more, but those are the only ones that are coming to my mind right now. So I like all of those ones a lot. So anyway, that was the first book that I read. All right, the next book I read is The Snow Child. And I apparently like Alaska books. I don't know, because this is also about Alaska. So The Great Alone, I think that's what it's called. I always want it like The Great Beyond. No, that's like Land Before Time, but anyway. And so that's an Alaska book as well. And then this same author, I'm not even trying to say her name. I did try to in January because I read one of her books last year. I opened it so I remember what it's called. It's To the Bright Edge of the World. And so I read that one last year and put it as one of my top 10 books for the year. And that was about Alaska also. I think the time period is a little bit before this time period because it's like when there was nobody there really. And this is in the early 1900s, so 1920, and it's about a couple, I believe they're like in their 50s, and they go to homestead in Alaska. And they come from, well, I think he comes from a farming background. She comes from a pretty well-off family in different parts of the United States, and they decide they want to go to Alaska to homestead. And weren't able to have kids. I think they had one child that was stillborn, and that was it. And so that's a very difficult part for her. And so then they get into the story about the snow child, and that's what happens throughout this whole story, is explaining what that is. And I think it kind of talks a little bit about it back here, how they glimpse a girl running through the trees and they end up kind of becoming her pseudo parents, and it goes into this whole story about that. And again, this one it's happy and it's sad and it's full of a lot of things about just how rough life was on those early frontiers. You know, when nobody else lived there. I'm sure in Alaska it's still pretty rough in some places, but on those early frontiers, and just, you know, they basically were trying to just survive the winter. It's like, this is our first winter here. We didn't have a big enough crop. We need to get the crops down. And it's like, if we don't get this, like, we have to just give up and move back home with family because we're not gonna be able to survive up here. Like, it's just the reality of that wilderness world. And so it goes through all those types of things as well, and talks about their neighbors. They have like one neighbor that's several miles away and stuff. So it goes through all those things, but I really like the story. It was actually a book club book. I haven't been going to book club recently. Part of it was having babies and everything that kind of threw me off, but then I just now feel like I'm an old woman. You know, the book club starts at 8 o'clock and I am going up to bed at 9 o'clock. So I'm like, maybe one night a month I could do it, but I'm just usually up forever because we talk so long at book club and then I'm like wide awake. So I haven't been going for a while, and it was like I couldn't easily go because my husband's schedule was different, and now it's changed so I could go, but I haven't been. But I still love to read the books because they're always so good. So I feel like this would be a good book club book, a good discussion book, because there were some things in here after I finished it, I was like, and book club was already done by the time I finished this. They had already talked about it, but I wanted to be like, wait, what did you think about this? Or like, what is happening here? Because there are a few things that I feel like having a few other people talk about it might make it clearer, or at least provide some different theories. So it was a really interesting book to read. The next book I read was James, and this one, like, it just looks so cool. It reminds me of James and the Giant Peach, not just because of the name, but I feel like, I don't know, the cover in some sort of way does, but it's like a interesting cover. It has a different texture to it. This was also a book club book. And if you're not, I think this book just came out, maybe last year. I don't even know if it was this year or last year. Yeah, so last year sometime it had just come out. And so it's talking about James, or Jim, from Huckleberry Finn. So it has been years, like over 20 years since I read Huck Finn. And so there's a lot of things about it that I just don't remember. But this book takes Jim, or he goes James, perspective. He is one of the black slaves that, if you're familiar with Huckleberry Finn, that is helping Huck out some of the time, or they're kind of traveling together some of the time. And so it's his perspective on what is going on. So you hear probably stuff that is familiar. Like, as I read it, I was like, oh, there's a little bit of things that are familiar here from Huck Finn and his story of running away. And so Jim is also running away because they think he killed somebody. And so he is running away also. But it goes through, it was just interesting. Like, to have it almost made me go read Huck Finn again. But I was like, do I really want to read Huck Finn? I don't know. But again, this would be a really cool one to have at a book club and to be able to discuss, and especially with people that might remember or have more recently read Huck Finn, discuss the different perspectives and the perspective too from a white person versus a black person and the different things that were going on. And then obviously the end of the story is different than it is in Huck Finn, because him and Huck are then separated. And so then you hear the rest of what his story is. And it's fascinating. Like, I thought it was so interesting, the different take on it. And I will just leave you to figure it out, because I just think it's really cool, and loved having a different perspective on the story that I read as a teenager as part of one of my English classes. And this one I read by myself, of my own choosing, instead of saying you had to for a grade. And I really enjoyed it, and enjoyed having this perspective. All right, the next book I read was Dopamine Nation. This was actually my same friend in Texas was asking me if I'd read this book, and I was like, no. So I went and I got it because I like to read books, especially ones that other people recommend or are wondering about. And so I really enjoyed this book. I say that hesitantly because the first chapter starts off with a fairly intense masturbation story. I don't even know if I'm allowed to say that on YouTube, and it's a little bit intense as it goes through, and I'm like, oh my goodness gracious. And it kind of, the story, she comes back to it throughout the whole book. She tells lots of stories because she's a therapist, so I can't remember what kind, exact psychiatrist, and the author, obviously, of this book. And so she tells several different stories from different clients' perspectives, but it comes out, like, this book comes out and just like nails you in the face, I feel like, right from the get-go. It's a little bit like icky feeling, but then it gets better. So if you don't want to read that, which my friend in Texas decided not to, totally fine. I'm not judging anybody here. When I first read it, I almost wanted to put the book down and just be like, no, I'm done with this. I don't want to. But I was like, okay, that's probably, like, she came out with the most intense thing. It should get better, which it did get better from that. And I think her story was valid, even though it was it was pretty intense. And so she's going through, I just like this quote. So it's on the back, but I also marked it in the introduction. But it said, Dopamine Nation shows that the secret to finding balance is combining the science of desire with the wisdom of recovery. And so going through and just talking about all the stimuli that we get around us in the world today, that we're just surrounded by things that are constant and giving us kind of that high. It's almost similar to The Scarcity Brain by Michael Easter, but I enjoyed this book way better. Way better, is that good English? I don't know. Than The Scarcity Brain. I felt like this one was a little, besides the intense story, was a little bit easier to understand and more relatable in a lot of ways. And she goes through so many different stories, and the book's not as long as it looks because there's so much of the biography stuff, bibliography at the end and references. And one of the things that I did like in here, again, when I read these types of books, I just like to share quotes, because talking about the whole thing is kind of hard because it's just full of so many different examples. And I thought they were all very good, and she had very good points. But one of them, she was talking about, I believe, someone that probably was focused, what am I trying to say here? Who knows, really? But she talks about how sometimes today we need constant noise. Okay, we have either AirPods in, or we're listening to stuff all the time. Every time we do something, when we go for a walk, we have to have something we're listening to. In the car, we're listening to stuff. And at home, we're constantly listening to stuff, and how sometimes silence we don't like, or it scares us. And she had a client that it was, I think it was a younger girl. I can't remember exactly without going back and looking it all up. But she was so used to all the noise. And so she told her to become familiar with yourself. Sometimes we do that kind of stuff to block out actual thoughts that are going on that we need to process. So we get rid of them and fill them with other things, with TV shows or podcasts, instead of focusing, not that those things are inherently bad, but if we're trying to distract from things that we need to solve or that are going on in our brain, then they can become bad. And so she's like, it's like, go become familiar with yourself. Get rid of those things. Get rid of the noise and all those things. And she's like, but it's so boring, right? Like not having anything constantly stimulating you can be super boring. And she's like, yes, that's true. Boredom is not just boring, it can also be terrifying. It forces us to come face to face with bigger questions of meaning and purpose. But boredom is also an opportunity for discovery and invention, which is something I always tell my kids, like, it's good to be bored. It creates the space necessary for a new thought to form, without which we're endlessly reacting to stimuli around us, right? We're not creating anything, we just are being constantly stimulated, rather than allowing ourselves to be within our lived experience. Okay, where everything else is living life for us, we're not actually living it. And so she tried, for a week, this girl walking to class without being plugged into everything. And she said it was hard at first, but then I got used to it and even liked it. I started noticing the trees, which I just think is so cool. I hadn't paid attention to the trees because I was so distracted by all the noise in my ears and in my head from all the stimuli around me. But when I took a second to slow down and pay attention, I noticed the trees. And I think that's absolutely beautiful. And there's just lots of stories in here of people that you might relate to and some that you might not even be close to relating to, depending on their types of addictions and struggles. But I feel like it is the point of like slowing down, paying attention, looking at the world around you and noticing the trees, right? Noticing the beauty that surrounds us. I love to walk outside with no distractions. And I hate having stuff in my ears. I hate having headphones on and just paying attention to the world around you, because it's its own stimulus and you can learn so much from it. And it's just far more beautiful than listening to podcasts constantly and constantly having a TV or a screen that you're scrolling. It makes me sad when I see people walking and scrolling because I'm like, you're missing everything around you. So anyway, that's kind of my spiel on that book. Approach some of it with caution because it is a little bit intense, but I also thought it taught some really good principles. The next 3 books I'm gonna bunch together because they should be bunched together. They're a trilogy. And so it's I can't remember even what the trilogy is called. It's Scythe something trilogy. Anyway, my husband for Valentine's Day got me this book. So he's a professor and one of his students had recommended, they're like, oh, I really like this book. It has a little bit of romance in it, but it's an interesting book. So he got it for me and I was like, okay, cool. And so I started reading it, and when you read the premise of it, you might be like, that's kind of weird. So it's basically, it's a community trying to create a utopia, which anybody knows who's read anything about any other book trying to create a utopia always creates a dystopia, always. And so you have the Giver series that does the same type of thing. Any type of community where you're trying to create this perfect environment to function in ends up going wrong because you just can't do it. It's not possible. People are still human. So in this particular book, they're basically have created an immortal type of a world, and people, once they get to a certain age, they can just turn themselves back younger. If they want to experiment with death type things like jumping off a building, again, it's kind of weird. Some of it's a little bit weird when you're like, what? Then they're only dead-ish and they can be revived from that. So in order to control population, because they can't have that many people on the earth without people naturally dying, right? They've gotten rid of disease, rid of people just naturally dying, and so they have scythes that will glean the population, basically. They go through and have a certain quota they're supposed to make to keep the population where it needs to be. And so they go through and talk about, this first book is 2 apprentices to a scythe and the whole process of becoming one and what it means. And I really liked this book a lot, enough that I bought the second one before I even finished this one. I had only read 20 pages and bought the second one. And my husband was like, I should have just bought the whole box set. I thought about it. He's like, but what if she didn't like it? I was like, just get it off of Amazon and then I just return it. But so I really like this one. Thunderhead is next. I also liked this one a lot as well. The stories were really good. They leave on cliffhangers, but not as intense as some books. So like the Lunar Chronicles are pretty intense cliffhangers at the end. I feel like these weren't quite like that, but they were still really good and have some different storylines. And again, these would be, I feel like these would be really good book club books. At least the first one, if you didn't want to have to read all of the books, obviously, because talking about these kind of worlds where you think, oh, if we could just fix this, or if we can just fix this, right? We don't have counterfactuals, and so it's hard for us to see things and say, well, if you just did the opposite, that would be better. But who knows if it would actually be better if you could just do the opposite. Because we can't actually do that, right? We don't have that counterfactual. And so having these types of books that try to depict a utopia that turns to dystopia, I feel like are good books to talk about. So these two are really good. And then The Toll, I still read this one and liked it a lot. I had no problem reading through it. But I feel like they took a lot of storylines and tried to tie everything up. And I feel like at the end, I was kind of still like, wait, what? So I am hesitant to tell you that because I don't want you to be like, well, I don't want to read it for that. I still feel like it was really good. Overall, the series was really good. And I haven't read any other books by him. I saw that he has several. So if you have and there's other ones you like, recommend them because I'd like to check some of them out, but I haven't even looked to see what they're about. But I really still enjoyed all the books, even though this one I feel like wasn't quite as like tied up and cohesive as I wanted it to be. I felt like they were all still really good. There are some, again, some difficult issues with people dying, and that, which is a little bit weird in a world where it's like, if you do that, you're just dead. But also there's different homosexual and heterosexual relationships going on as well, or communities, because certain communities can decide how they want to live, if they want to be boys or girls or just whatever they are, so if you have issues with any of those things or don't like to read stuff with those kind of things, I'm letting you know in advance that they are in here. So if you don't want to read them, you probably don't want to look at these books. But I thought they were really good. Like, just even to start with this one and just see, because I feel like you'll probably like it as well because I loved it. All right, I wanted to quickly mention the book that I'm reading, the series I mentioned throughout the year, and then the one that I did not finish. So The Work and the Glory for this year for my church, we're studying church history, and this, there's 9 books. I read them when I was maybe my early teens. I might have been a little bit younger, and went through all of them because it's a story, so it's historical fiction. I feel like it's a little heavier on the history than the fiction compared to some books. It depends on the balance of the book. Some focus more on the story and put in some history. Some are kind of in the middle. This one's probably on the other side where it has a lot more history. A little, like, the fiction is still there, but it's not as strong of a story. So anyways, I'm just rereading through them. But it's a slower process. This one, actually, I think my kids were playing with the book because I'm like, oh, my bookmark's not even in here anymore. I'm not quite halfway through. I think I'm close. Was I close to halfway? I don't know. I'll figure it out. But like I said, I read them all when I was younger, and I just wanted to reread through them and kind of have some of that church history fresh in my mind. So if I talk about them through book reviews, they're kind of there. And if I need something on Sunday to read, or I finished a book and haven't started another one, I pick that up. But I'm not always constantly reading it, which is why I'm not done with it yet. And then the book I did not finish is Boundaries. And this video is already really long, so I'm gonna try to make this as concise as possible. But the funny part is I got this book years ago, and it was like a small hard copy. Someone I knew in Florida gave it to me, and I never read it. I thought about reading it several times and then just never did. And then I got rid of it, gave it to like Goodwill. And then Jordan Page mentioned she loved this book. And so I was like, it must be a good book. So I got it again, and I've been trying to read it for months. I kid you not, since like last year in September or October. And I hardly made it, like maybe I was halfway. I don't even know if I made it that far. And here's why. maybe if you listen to it, it'll be different, okay? Like trying to just straight read it, I feel like was really hard for me. I have 2 books right now, this one and one other I can think of that I have not finished in recent years because of the way they were written. I almost always finish books. So when I don't, it's like, okay. But the idea, so it's a very strongly Christian book. And I think in a way that makes it hard. I'm not saying incorporating the Bible into writing is a bad thing. You just have to do it in the right way. It's kind of, I've mentioned before how sometimes I read books that are heavily on the research side. And so when you read a paragraph, it's like this research, and then it maybe has one line that's normal, and then it just talks about research. And so it's kind of, you get lost in what you're supposed to actually be learning from the book because of so much quotes from research. That's how I feel like this book is, except with scripture. So I feel like one scripture can be very powerful, and you can say it and then go through an explanation, have stories and talk about it. This one quotes scripture constantly, like constantly. Maybe again, if you're listening to it, it's different, but it's kind of hard to understand all the points that it's trying to point out, because it starts to say something and then goes straight into scripture and then starts to say something again and does it again. And I'm like, wait, what? Like, I don't know. It was so hard for me to be like, I don't know what I'm supposed to be getting out of this book, because you're just constantly quoting scripture. It's like you're interrupting your thoughts with scripture. And so then I don't understand what's going on. Like, there's power in synthesizing, but I feel like this isn't done well. Even though this book is very popular, it's an older book, but I just had a really hard time. Like, I tried 4 months, not just 4 months, but like 4 months. My husband's like, just don't read it. If it's like, it would stress me out. Like, I'm like, no, I gotta finish the book. I should like it too. It's Christian based, but I couldn't do it. I don't know. So I just set it aside and we're done with the book. But if you have thoughts about it, if you were able to get through it, I feel like there are some good points in here, but again, I feel like it's muddled because of the way it's written. And it just makes it hard for me to pick out what I'm even supposed to learn or want to read it because of that. So that's the book I did not finish. All right, so those are all the books I read. This is a long video. I'm all sweaty. You guys get me all worked up over here. Maybe because the heater is on too. I'm like, it's hot. Go stand out in the snow for a second. But I hope you enjoyed this video. I'll put links to all these books down below, even the one that I did not finish reading. And if you have book recommendations for me, I would love to hear them. Again, like, most of these books are not just me looking for books. They come from everyone else recommending them. And I usually end up liking them a lot for the most part. I have very few that, even though I finished them, I did not, like them. Like, there's only a few probably that I'd go through and be like, oh, maybe I won't read that one again, but I still finished it. So put your recommendations down below, because I'd love to hear them, love to see them, and it's probably helpful for anybody else watching this video. Remember to give this video a thumbs up, and I will see you next time.